Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Monday. Hope you had a great weekend. Hope you got out and did something with your collector car. Hopefully, if that was at all possible. Let me turn down some of the sound here. Apparently, every time I get a message, it goes beep. Beep. How's your beeping doing? All right. Hey, I just got off the phone. Actually, it wasn't on the phone. Did a Zoom meeting with a car club called the Gentleman's Driving. Now, this is a great organization. Now, before you think about, gentlemen driving, no, it's not something that eliminates women or other people of other sorts. Gentlemen driving is based on the definition from the people that put on the 24 Hours of Le Mans. And what that is, gentlemen driving was a requirement in the classes that a non-professional driver be one of the team drivers. So it could be male, it could be female. It just meant a non-professional driver. So you can check them out on Facebook, Gentlemen Driving. And they are set, not Gentlemen Driving Club. Stop that. Gentlemen Driving. And I'll send you a link. I'll post it on my page as well. But along the lines of that, a lot of guys have sports cars. And this group is comprised of those people that drive sporty cars. Some of them professional drivers. Some of them teach professional drivers. Others build cars. Others organize events. And it seems to be a good group to be with. And I'm joined up with the club, and I'm going to be one of their local ambassadors here in the United States. They're based out of Spain. They are a worldwide club, and they are in 16 different countries at this point in time. But today, let's move on to America's greatest sports car. And I say that without reservations because the Corvette is the longest production running sports car in the U.S. Now, there have been other sports cars along the way. Kaiser had the Darren. It was also fiberglass and kind of a unique sliding door. The doors didn't open up in conventional fashion. They slid into the front fender. As the Corvette, they were six-cylinder powered, but their six-cylinder was an antiquated flathead. They did have a supercharger option, but you don't really hear much about them, and they only lasted for a few days. Hi, Jim Dillo. How are you? And Cassie Nunez. Raphael from Italy. Thank you for tuning in this morning. And glad you could be here with us. Mike St. Angel, Rob Pratt, Richard Candenhead. Good morning to you, too. Oh, and you're doing some cruising in the T. That is even better. We're going to be doing some cruising this weekend. Hi, Phil Hoffman and Phil Stearns. I'm just going over who we've got already. Jay Black, did have a chance to pull you up here, but we didn't do it just yet. So we'll work on that for another time. Merrick, how are you this morning? All right, so the Corvette is the premier and the only long-running sports car. Now, some people say, oh, what about the Cobra? Well, the Cobra was a sports car. The Cobra was assembled partially here in the U.S., but if you look at the history, the Cobra was British. Now, AC, a company in the United Kingdom, was building beautiful sports cars, and the body used on the Cobra was amazing. What's Cassie saying already? What's the deal with the Corvette and the mid-engine? It's technology and progression. I'll get into that in just a little bit, though, Cassie. All right, so the Cobra, although it's really an American hot rod. Carroll Shelby, with small Ford V8s, created an amazing sports car, and it gave the Corvettes and everyone else fits when it came out. They were fast. They were good handling cars, and they dominated sports car racing. Now, they upped it to the 427, and that made it a world-class beater that was difficult for anyone to touch, and it was an amazing machine. But let's stick with the Corvette and its competitors. Now, in the U.S., you had the Dodge Viper for a while, a few years, but they went out of business. Well, they didn't go out of business. Chrysler's still around, but Fiat didn't continue the production of the Viper. Will it return? It might, but it really wasn't a sports car. It was more of a GT. And it did compete against the Corvette very successfully in racing. As a matter of fact, winning Le Mans. Why didn't Chrysler keep producing the car? Well, they were hand-built, they were expensive, and they couldn't build enough to make it profitable. It's gone. Had an interesting engine, though, the V10. Now, the Corvette came out in 1953. They were introduced at the Waldorf Astoria, the New York Auto Show. Now, for those of you who are old enough to be there at the time, I don't think anyone that age is watching right now. But anyway, there were 3 models introduced. There was the Roadster, which became the Corvette as we know it. There was a coupe, a fastback, beautiful fastback. It was called the Corvair. Imagine that. And there was a station wagon called the Nomad. All right, so the Nomad came to fruition based on the full-size Chevy in 1955. The Corvair ended up being a compact car coming out in 1959. The Corvette Roadster was more of what General Motors saw as a sports car. You've got to remember back in 1953, the sports cars were just starting to come into the U.S. Servicemen who had served in Europe were buying MGs, Jaguars, and such, and bringing them here to the United States. It started a craze. There was a distributor bringing in those as well. And they started to populate the automotive scene. They were fun. They were good handling. They got good gas mileage. General Motors, though, didn't have the finger on the pulse of what really was going on. And when the Corvette was introduced in 1953, it had the Blue Flame 6. Okay, that was okay. It had good horsepower, 150. The car weighed a little over 2,000 pounds, 2,500 pounds, so it was, or could have been, pretty good performing. But Chevrolet saddled it with a Power Glide 2-speed automatic transmission. Why? No one knows. No one can answer that question. The 6-cylinder had side draft carburetors, higher compression. It met the concept of, let's just say, a Jaguar, except that it was overhead valve, and it was basically the same engine you could find in your Corvette or Chevrolet sedan, except without the side draft carburetors. Raphael from Italy is saying the Corvette was America's Ferrari, a true milestone. There are a lot of vets there in Italy and many enthusiasts with it. And you know what? The drivers club that I just talked about, the gentlemen drivers, that would be a good organization for them. And I'll post information about that at a later date. But the Corvette missed the mark with the automatic transmission. And in 1953, when they were introduced to the dealership, they were hard-pressed to sell them. They had side curtains, no roll-up windows. They didn't even have door handles. You had to reach in the car to open the door. You could get it any color you wanted, as long as it was polo white with a red interior. You had hubcaps, which was pretty typical at the time. No wire wheel option. Hi, Neil Panks. How are you doing this morning? So that was okay. I mean, even the Jaguars of the day had steel wheels, and as did the MGs and Triumphs, but they also had wire wheel options. Now, could they have done wire wheels on the Corvette? Yeah, they could have. It would have cost more, and it would have taken more effort to wire up wheels or buy them from Kelsey Hayes or whoever else was manufacturing them at the time. But the problem basically was automatic transmission. It's not a sports car. They carried over the front suspension from a sedan. Not really that good. You couldn't race them. That Power Glide just wasn't there. So the early Corvettes, 1953 to 1954, with only a 6-cylinder, really didn't catch on with performance. They didn't have it. It wasn't there. They were cool looking. I love the 53, 54, and 55 Corvettes. But the power didn't come about until 1955, when Zora Argus Duntov became part of the staff and put the V8 in the Corvette. That brightened that car. That woke that car up. Now you've got the attention of the enthusiast. At the same time, though, Ford introduced the two-seat Thunderbird. Now, Ford never marketed the two-seat Thunderbird as a sports car. It was a personal luxury car. And the Thunderbird really was. You could get a 3-speed manual transmission, and you can get an automatic transmission in 1955, but they were 6-volt electrical systems. It had the Y-block, very heavy engine over the front. Good at drag racing, and a lot of them showed up at the drag strips, but not really a handling car. It was a boulevard car. Corvette's biggest downfall, though, besides the 6-cylinder and the automatic transmission and the lack of windows and the lack of color choices, were the brakes. They came directly from the Chevrolet sedan. So for performance driving, those brakes were highly inadequate, and it wasn't until the C2 came out with the disc brake option, well, it became standard, actually, it wasn't an option, that Corvette got a proper braking system. Although the suspension from 1953 pretty much stayed the same in the front through 1982. Yeah, pretty much the same front suspension that the car was introduced with. Rear suspension changed, though, of course. It went to an independent in 1963, which was a world-beating suspension at the time. Now, that was very high-tech, but Chevrolet still used drum brakes in 1963. That was the downfall of the Corvette in racing. The brakes would wear out, the brakes would go away before a race would finish. So that was the problem with the early Corvettes, braking in racing. Now, we're going to talk more about the first gens and let you know about that. They started out being built in Flint, Michigan. Each one was handmade. They hand laid up the fiberglass pieces for the body. They hand assembled the bodies. They spent a lot of time and a lot of attention to making these cars cool. The 53s were built in Flint, Michigan, but the next year, they started in St. Louis and stayed in St. Louis through the early 1980s when they moved to Bowling Green, where Corvettes are produced now. All right, so the C1 Corvettes are all of the Corvettes that had a solid rear axle. There were various body styles for the C1 Corvette, beginning in 1953, the 53 to 55, the 56 through 57 had single headlights, different body. 58 changed the body again. 61 changed the body again. Got the tail that replicates what was put on the 1963s. The C3, the biggest innovation of the Corvettes, starting in 1963, was the independent suspension and the spined coupe, the fastback. Wow, that was an amazing machine. Ivan Schreiber saying, no bad vets, no bad pizza. Yeah, you got that right. They're not bad, they're just challenged in some ways. But the 63 Corvette, oh, that was an amazing car. So the first generation Corvettes, the solid axle, that's a solid rear axle in the back, were 53 to 62. And those are some of the more popular Corvettes. And what's popular about them is they were the start. They were the beginning of the Corvettes. Let's see, Cassie is saying, fun fact, 1968 Chevelle borrowed front disc brakes from the Corvette. Could have been. And the Corvette was the first General Motors domestic car produced in the U.S. and sold that had a disc brake on it. So the Corvette paved the way for other Chevrolet vehicles to have disc brakes. Mike St. Angel's C1s had a wooden body mold. They had a mold. I don't know. It may have been wood, Michael, but it was a hand lay-up fiberglass where they had strips of fiberglass that matte they would put into the mold. And I'll take a look at some photographs and see what I can find out on that one for you. Ivan Schreiber 327 was a very good engine. Yes, it was. And it appeared in many vehicles, not just the Corvette. All right, so I'm going to see if I can find that molds for this 1953 Corvette and see what they say. And hold on here. We'll do some research. And what they say. Yep, Wooden body bucks created the first Corvette, Michael. You are quite right there. So they hand carved these molds out of wood, mahogany to be exact, and that is what was used to make the Corvette body. Now, the Corvette molds consisted of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different components, and they would attach those together, and that made the basic body. Now, one of the jokes I heard, when the Corvette first came off the assembly line, they used typical assembly line production methods. Well, they ran the ground cables from the chassis to the body. Turned the key and nothing happened. Fiberglass doesn't conduct electricity very well, so they had to quickly change where the grounds ran on the car and reground everything. All right, but let's go back to the Corvette as we were talking. So the C1 is all the solid axle. C2 is the beginning of the Stingray, 1963 to 1967. Now, it was only supposed to run till 1966, but there were some delays with issues with the 1968 Corvette, so it didn't make 1967 production like it did, although the 67 C2 is considered the most advanced of them all. Seth Emerson says Studebaker had disc brakes on the Avanti in 1963, 2 years before the Corvette. Yes, Studebaker was way ahead of their time on many of their cars. They were early into the V8, overhead valve V8s as well, dating back to the late 1940s, early 1950s, predating Chevrolet, and it was a pretty stout motor. And the Avanti was also fiberglass, but it was a 4-seat. It was more of a grand touring car. And I'll tell you what, Avanti's on my bucket list. I would love to have a real Studebaker Avanti. Obviously, the best one to me would be the first generation Avanti with the round glass-covered headlights. So that would be something on my bucket list. Now, the 63 Corvette Stingray came out with a spine on the back. Bill Mitchell demanded that spine stay there. Public was not real happy with that spine. It looked great from the outside. Hi, Bob Klein. How are you this morning? But you couldn't see out through the mirror out the back very easily. So the spine disappeared in 1964. It was a 1-year issue. So the Corvette Stingray with the spine and the split window, 1963 only. And it was the first year of the Stingrays. Now, the second generation lasted through 1967, and in 1968, the all-new Mako Shark style Corvette came out, and that body style ran with minor changes and some major changes to the body from 1968 to 1982, and those were the years performance really was king. Until the smog regulations came in. Now, the 63 to 67 did get the big block. They got the 396 and they got the 427s. They got the special models for racing. They had the big tank cars. They had the big brake cars. They had the special Grand Sports. But the 1968, that was a big year for Chevrolet. They introduced a totally redesigned body-wise Corvette. I say body-wise because the suspension, the chassis, was a carryover from 1963. Now, they did improve the brakes. It had 4-wheel disc brakes. But not much more was changed. And the car was gorgeous. I'd love to have a steel bumper. 68, 69, 70. Small block, 4-speed. Got to have air conditioning. Those cars got hot. And that was one of the issues with the Corvette. There wasn't a big enough grill space or opening to get air in on the big block cars. And they had heating issues. But it was still an amazing car. And the basic body for 1968 stayed in production through 1982. Now, they had to add the rubber baby buggy bumpers. And they put a big rear window in the back. Later on, they added better seating. They changed the dashboard a little bit, but in general, the 1968 Corvette stayed in production through 1982. Now, there was no 1983 model Corvette. They didn't make it. Chevrolet was having issues and did not make the production time they needed to get the new C4 Corvette released in 1983. So there were no production 1983 cars. Now, there are 1983 Corvettes. There were 50 of them made. One is on display at the Corvette Museum in Bowling Green, Kentucky, but none were sold to the public. And it was a little bit different from what actually came out in 1984. I had the opportunity to drive the 1984 Car of the Year machine, used by Motor Trend magazine to determine it was the Car of the Year. Cassie Nunez says, let's see, 68 Corvette Camaro Chevelle. I mean, there's a better year? Oh, yeah, there's a lot better years. But anyway, I got to drive the C4 Corvette when it first came out. It was a manual transmission, had a Doug Nash transmission in it, which was basically a 4-speed transmission through some magic in the electronics where you had overdrive on second, third, and fourth gears. Now, in theory, that probably worked real well. In actuality, it didn't. And by 1989, Chevrolet had switched to a Getrag 6-speed, and that's what I have in my car. And it is a smooth transmission. It is a 6-speed. You don't have the electronics issues that they had with the Doug Nash, and a lot of people, when they could, would convert that Doug Nash to a real transmission and get rid of the electronics. The automatic transmission, 700R, it's a 700R. It did great. So the Corvette came out with some special editions through its years, including the anniversary editions, and they have been a pace car at Indy numerous times. So the C4 Corvette came out, and it lasted through 1996. That had an extremely long run, and again, with that car, they made minor changes, different body components, wider fenders. It did have a twin-cam V8 for a while. That was a sweet motor. Now, Mercury Marine produced that motor for General Motors, and they still can produce the engine. They hold the rights and the tooling, but for some reason, they never have. And the report I got from a General Motors official was that engine was so bulletproof, they never really had warranty claims on that engine. They dropped it in favor of the LS series engines that came out. And they started coming out. The LT1s came out. They were producing as much horsepower with a single overhead valve or the single cam overhead valve engines versus the more complex dual overhead cam engine, which was more costly to build, especially when you got someone outside the company building the motor for you. So the C4 Corvette stayed in production until 96 when the C5 came out. The C5 totally revamped car. Completely different from the C4 it replaced. Smoother riding. More solid chassis. Nicer body styling in some cases. I like the rounded style. I have both the C4 and the C5 Corvettes. And I do like driving the C5. It's smoother. It's easier to get into. Another situation that changed with the C5 Corvette is the frame rails no longer came up alongside the driver. C4 is a little bit more difficult to get into. C5 rides smoother. My C4 versus the C5 is like the difference between a buckboard and a Cadillac. The C4 is rough riding. It's got all the race suspension from the factory, the Z51 suspension. It's got the race quick ratio steering wheel. It's got the race oil coolers and everything else. It's got the huge brakes on it. It is a wonderful car. It's raw compared to a C5. C6 pretty much was a carryover chassis-wise from the C5. And the C4, and another thing I got to bring out, is C4 was the first totally re-engineered Corvette. It was the first time they got rid of the antiquated front suspension that was plaguing the Corvettes from the beginning. The C4 was so good, in fact, that when it hit the racetracks, the competitors complained about it in the A class because it was blowing the doors off of everyone. Now, people complain, oh, it didn't have any horsepower. For the time, it had excellent horsepower. Again, for the time. And it was enough that it blew the doors off the competition in SCCA road racing to the point that SCCA created a new class just for the Corvette. And it was called the Corvette Challenge series. Chevrolet stepped up with a number of specialty built cars. You could go into a dealership and buy a Corvette Challenge car. Race engine, roll cage, special wheels, upgraded suspensions, ready to go racing. Turn the key, go race. Those are the most expensive fourth generation Corvettes you can find. And it was probably one of the only times you could go into a dealership and order a Corvette ready to race. Road race, that is. Not drag race, road race. All right, so the C4 went into production in 1994, or late 1993 is in 94, stayed in production until 2004. The 96. 97 was the C5 through 94 or 2004, and the C6 was 2005 to 2013. Another beautiful car. Love the styling of the C6. It stayed in production through 2013. Minor changes from the C5. Now the ZL1s came out, the Z06s came out. These were high performance models. You can get a supercharged C6. Great cars. C7 came out. This was a beautiful car as well. Totally redesigned. Sharper lines, more horsepower, better handling. Every scoop, everything on the car designed to be aerodynamic. How many 57 Corvettes came with factory-installed 4-speed? I'd have to look that up, Tim. I really don't know. But the C6 Corvette and the C7 Corvettes were great. The C8 is amazing. Now, the 7th generation Corvette, still front engine, rear drive, was 2014 to 2019. What has replaced it is the new C8. The C8 has hit the streets. I've seen a couple of them on the streets. I was able to go to the press preview of the C8, and it is the mid-engine Corvette that Zora Argus Duntov wanted General Motors to produce way back in the 70s. Duntov knew the mid-engine was a better weight distribution for a sports car. Ferrari, Lamborghini, Maserati, they've all gone mid-engine. Porsche's even got mid-engine cars because they were better balanced. Chevrolet drug their feet on it. They finally came out with the C8 Corvette, and it is amazing. Now, it's got some limitations now. It's only a paddle shift automatic transmission. But I'll tell you what, it is a beautiful car, and it is going to carry Corvette into the next generation easily, and it's going to be a dominant factor in racing once they hit the racetracks, once the CV19 is declared over and we can go back to racing, that is. All right, Jonathan, thank you for tuning in. Jonathan Sarrett from the Drivers Club. Gentlemen drivers. Don Gady, drag racing extraordinaire, is watching us as well. So the C8 Corvette, now the car to beat. We'll see how it does on the racetrack once racing begins again. But everything I've read and every review I've seen is very favorable. The car is amazingly quick. It's an amazing handling car, far greater than any other Corvette has been. And its history, or its part in history, will be made very soon. I'm Hot Rod Bob, and you've got Gas, the morning edition. Thank you for tuning in. Gas is brought to you by Valley Head Service, Irwindale Speedway, Irwindale Drag Strip, Service Tech for your shop equipment needs, Moon Eyes, Tucker Tire, and BUA, Beach Underwriting Associates. I'm Hot Rod Bob Beck, and you've got Gas, the morning edition, part of Two Tired Guys Productions. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll get more information out to you about what's happening in car world. Now, as far as cruises, going on a Corvette cruise this weekend. So I figured it was appropriate to talk about Corvettes today. Take care, folks. You have a great day. I'm Hot Rod Bob, and you've got Gas.